Hi class, so this is a video to discuss this week's readings. I just wanted to go over some ideas and questions that I want you to consider. So we are looking at Asia Y. Martinez's two chapters about critical race theory and specifically counterstory. So we're looking at two things. We're learning about critical race theory, which has been in the news lately a lot. And then we're also learning about the idea of counterstory. So what is critical race theory? So it's a movement and collection of scholars and activists engaged in studying and transforming the relationship among race, racism, and power. So this is really important, right? Trying to think about how does the idea of race, the practices of racism, and then how that collects power and has power in our lives, how are we to understand them? So that's what critical race theory as a larger field is trying to consider. It's an offshoot of critical legal studies, so a lot of the original people who began to do this work were lawyers and were interested in the way that the law supports racism, and the way that the law has, although we understand the law to be blind and to judge people or to consider people innocent until proven guilty, what they were interested in showing was that actually the law is biased and it is inherently based in the system of white supremacy and racism. And so even though we consider the law as colorblind, right, that it treats everybody equally, the truth of the matter is that their work has proven that that is not the case. So colorblind ideology is really central to this idea of critical race theory, which is the idea that we can live without seeing a person's race. Oftentimes we hear people say, I don't see race, or we're all just humans, race doesn't matter. But that is just not true. Race does matter. Everything in our lives is actually, especially in the US, understood under the terms of race. And actually your life outcome, right, whether how old you are when you die, for example, can be determined by your race. So white communities live longer and than Black communities, for example, and have longer life expectancies because of the way that their lives are impacted by race. So Black communities not only have to deal with the trauma of racism on an everyday basis, which psychologically can affect their life, but also access to medical professionals and medical professionals that believe them when they're sick, and then also access to education, which impacts your ability to gain employment and how much you get paid, and that also impacts your access to healthcare. So all of these things are connected in the systems that we live that organize our lives, and those systems are crossed by or impacted by race. And that's why when we say systemic racism, what we're talking about is the way that the systems, specifically the law, for example, is a very clear example, supports racism. And so we are trying to figure out how is it that we are able to see the way that the system, while it proposes that it is colorblind, it actually is biased and perpetuates racism and how that impacts people's lives. So one of the major in critiques of critical race theory is the idea that the United States has ideals that are actually don't support the equality of people or don't support the idea that we are all just one human race. So it's called abstract liberalism, and it focuses on individualism, the idea of liberty and equal opportunity and choice. So these ideas are basically can be summed up in if you work hard and you are a good person, you will be successful in this country. So that is a really shorthand way of understanding abstract liberalism, so that it is your own personal choice and your individual effort that actually determines your quality of life, which is just simply not true. Your quality of life is determined by a lot more variables than just your ability or your willingness to work hard, or your ability and willingness to choose to be, a good person, whatever that may mean, right? And that usually means, like you're not a criminal, you're educated, you've gone to school, you get a job, you can buy a house, you can be married, and have a family, and you have not committed any crimes, and therefore you are a good person. And if you meet all those boxes, then you will be successful. But the truth of the matter is that there is a systemic there's several systems in place that when we consider race into that idea, we see that that falls apart. So affirmative action is one of the things that usually people argue against in terms of uh, because they say that everyone should have an equal opportunity, and affirmative action gives special privileges to people, but it's actually trying to rectify the enslavement period of this country, right? So when people didn't have access to education, didn't have access, they weren't even actually considered people, right? So what does it mean to try to rectify the fact that there is organizations where there are no Black, Indigenous, or people of color as employees or as are participants of that institution? So even in education, right, these elite institutions like Harvard are still predominantly white institutions, and so affirmative action is trying to get those institutions to consider, how do you bring people who have been systematically oppressed into that space? You have to do it in a way that is not about equality, but it's about recognizing that they have not had the same access for a long time, and so there has to be a special consideration for that. So it comes against this idea of equal opportunity, that you can just choose to go to Harvard, and if you want to go to Harvard, you would, and you worked hard enough and you have the grades, you would get in, and sometimes that is just not true. So that is also within the civil rights movement. One of the things that there is this idea that the civil rights movement, because of the Voting Rights Act, because of desegregation, because of a bunch of policies that try affirmative action as well, try to rectify the injustices and disproportionate oppression that was faced by specifically African American, Black, and Mexican peoples in the United States for the most part. Some Asian communities, like the Chinese and Japanese immigrants that were more established during the 1960s, there was this idea that civil rights removed racism, because it changed the system of Jim Crow, right? So it made a system that was segregate, like very visually and publicly separating people through segregation based on race. It sort of tried to rectify that system. And so there's this idea that, after the civil rights movement, there was a change in the racism of the country. But actually what Dr. Martinez discusses, and Dr. Bonilla Silva discusses, is that the practices of racism just became subtle, embedded in structures, and seen as non-racial. So this is where that colorblind ideology comes in again. So that racism no longer was something we could talk about, no longer was something that was starkly visible because of segregation, and then we tried to move away from discussing racism and making things non-racial. But at the heart of this is white supremacy. So I know that white supremacy is a term that we have now been hearing more and more, but I want you to make sure that you all know what it is. So it is an ideology, meaning is a set of ideas that may or may not be true, that the white race is superior from other races. And these ideas were solidified historically through different series of historical processes, including the Crusades, the Spanish Inquisition, and finally the colonial projects in Latin Americas. The colonial projects in the Americas, so from Canada all the way to South America, including Central America and the Caribbean, really at that moment of the European project of taking over the lands in this part of the hemisphere, was when they were able to write and try to justify that the perception of white Europeans, specifically the Spanish, British, Portuguese, and some Dutch colonies, that they had the tools necessary to take over the land and um, to truly make it worth something, because as it was being used by the indigenous people of the Americas, they were backwards, right? So there was this idea that the indigenous people were savages, that they were backwards, that they didn't know what they were doing, that they were, that they didn't dress, that, they didn't have, that they didn't value gold in the same way. So these ideas really solidified that whiteness was somehow superior. And then with the invention of industry like cotton, sugar, tobacco, and the need for labor and the buying of um, black West African black folks on the continent of Africa, then that those ideas of who was more suited for labor, after a lot of indigenous people died from diseases, then the transatlantic slave trade began, that further solidified the idea that the white race is superior, and that it should be the leader and it should conquer and decide what non-white people would do with their lives at the moment of conquest. So also the ideas of pure blood are tied to white supremacy, and the segregation that happened during Jim Crow is a clear evidence of this idea of coming to be solidified in the United States. Okay, so counterstory then is a method that can be used to make visible how white supremacy, race, and racism and power intertwine and impact our lives. It uses storytelling to show examples of how Black, Indigenous, and people of color experience racism and other intersecting oppressions. So if you go to the text, which I will show you now, on this page, on page 9, are the tenets of CRT, of critical race theory, and they are the permanence of race and racism, the challenge to dominant ideologies, interest convergence, race and social as a social construct, intersectionality and anti-essentialism, interdisciplinarity, centrality of experimental knowledge, and unique voices of color. And this is kind of at the heart of counter story, and then the commitment to social justice. So make sure that you review what each of these tenets is and what does it mean. But specifically, counterstory, right, is this mode of trying to talk about race, racism, and power through storytelling, which has systematically been devalued, right? So storytelling usually isn't the way that we feel is the most important way to learn something. And so counterstory tries to retell stories from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, people of color, to discuss the way that race and racism impacts our lives every day. So Space Raiders, which is a movie that I put on Blackboard for this week, make sure that you do watch it. It's very entertaining. It was written by Derek Bell, he's one of the founders of critical race theory. Is an example of counterstory. So I want you to think, what makes this a good example of what Martinez discusses in the first chapter in counterstory. And I look forward to hearing your ideas on the Padlet next week. Please email me with any questions.